Born in the USA. Born in the USA. There's a lot of 400 million people know that they can claim to do it now. I cannot be one of them because I'm Canadian, you know. Not born in the USA. Not born in the USA. Hey there, Heather Ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Down and welcome you to another World Cup Stories video. And it's week 3 as we do a 10-week series, and week 3 will bring you the hubnut of the American national team. Week 1, we talked about the groups and all that and my way too early predictions. And week 2, we talked about Mexico, one of the 3 co-hosts for the World Cup. You know, they have their 3rd World Cup as a host after 1786. And now let's talk about the main co-host, if you will, the guys who have like 60 out of 80 matches or whatever they call it, a lot of matches in the U.S. despite the political turmoil and all that, that threatened to lose a few teams and threatened to have a few cities lose their things because they didn't bound on pressure. But what do I know? So anyway, we're going to talk about the Americans in the World Cup and all that and see what we can do to cheer you up. Express yourself. You just can't go wrong now. Express yourself. They need to know it. Express yourselves. It's never wrong if you can do it all the time. Soccer brings the world in motion, and Canada's a co host now. Soccer's got the world in motion. US and Mexico host too. Express yourself. It's one-on-one. Express yourself. 48 nations all. Express yourself. You can't go wrong because this might be the best World Cup ever. Soccer's got the world in motion. That I know. It has to be true. Soccer is big sport, and some stories are here for you. Okay, so we're taking a look at the USA's World Cup appearances and all that. Did you know that the Americans actually were in the first World Cup in 1930? You'd be thinking they were that good? Well, kind of. 1930 was more of an invitation only tournament because, you know, they were testing out the World Cup waters. So they ended up inviting 16 nations and all that, and the U.S. were one of them. Well, Uruguay, it would be easy for them to get to Uruguay because they're in North America, and then, of course, you know, Uruguay's in South America. And, of course, travel was not the best a century ago. So that was the whole discord, if you will, and everything else in likelihood. So they actually did okay. They were 2-1 in their group. They got to play in the playoff. Well, they ended up 3rd place against Yugoslavia. So, anyhow, their World Cup stuff was impressive and all that. They were in Group 4. They beat Belgium and Paraguay, and then because they won their group, they got to go to the semifinals, and then they ended up getting their butts whipped by Argentina 6-1. I mean, come on, Argentina. By the way, McGee, Flory, and Pannerud scored for Belgium against Belgium, and Pannerud had a hat trick against Paraguay, which was supposed to be the first World Cup hat trick, but it wasn't. Then in 1934, they actually played Mexico in a playoff in Italy. The powers that be decided to have the Mexicans and Americans travel all the way to Rome for one game, and the loser would have to travel home. So anyhow, the Americans beat Mexico and then took out Italy, the host nation. When they decided to do the knockouts thing in 1934, like 16 countries, no groups, just a knockout phase. Italy beat the shit out of them, and Aldo Donelli, who went on to play in the NFL, had a goal. So they didn't get to 1938. In 1950, the first World Cup after World War II, They were placed in Group 2 with Spain, England, and Chile. They were expected to basically beat Chile but lose to Spain and England. On cue, they lost to Spain 3-1, although Perrone scored. But then they took on England and everything changed, as England were expected to wipe the floor with the Americans. Not so fast. The U.S. scored one goal on a goal by Joe Gations, a Haitian by relation. Hey, that rhymed. Unfortunately, though, that was the only goal. England somehow, in some freaking way, couldn't score past the American keeper, and the U.S. beat England 1-0. It was so shocking that a lot of English papers, and probably a lot of world papers, thought it was a typo, thinking that it was 10-1, not 1-0. But it happened. Only one journalist from the U.S. covered that game. And basically it was like, well, how do you know that happened? Anyway, they went on to get their butts whipped by Chile 5-2. Wallace and Maka scoring. The crazy thing is, they scored 2 goals against Spain and England combined. They scored twice against Chile, twice as much as they did in Spain and England, but they lost, especially when they beat England 1-0. So the United States actually went through a rut. Unlike Mexico, the Americans went through a massive rut. People forget that the U.S. actually had a 40-year World Cup drought. They've been to every World Cup since 1990. Of course, you kind of know that, you can't have a World Cup of America. Actually, no, they missed one. We'll talk about that later. But anyway, in 1990, they beat Trinidad and Tobago on the final day of CONCACAF, or the North American group qualification. Costa Rica was in, and so were the United States. The Americans kind of got lucky in 1990 because Mexico were DQ'd because of they fielded 2 overage players in a youth tournament and basically got and they got punished. Yeah, the Americans had a few good chances between 1950 and 1990 to make the World Cup. Hell, they were poor in 1986. That was when Canada got to the World Cup. Well, Mexico almost always stood in their way for CONCACAF, and it didn't help that FIFA only allowed one CONCACAF team in the World Cup at the time. So in 1990, they qualified, beating Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of people said it was fixed to try to screw over the Americans by Jack Warner, who was the president of CONCACAF and, of course, became vice president of FIFA and got bit in that FIFA corruption scandal. So the Americans were placed with the Czechs, the Italians, and the Austrians in Group A. Of course, this was the World Cup in Italy, so they would have to go to Italy and play the host again, like 1934. In the first game against the Czechs, they lost 5-1. They got butt whipped. Paul Cagliari scored a massive goal. And if I remember right, he was the guy with that 30-yard shot that beat the Trinidad players. They got their butts handed to them by Italy, but it was only 1-0, so Italy only beat them 1-0. So that was a better performance than the Czechs. It was like, why? Well, Italy had more of a defensive field. What is that? Cascio? I think it was, right? No. I don't know. The shut the door thing. They got beaten by Austria 2-1. Bruce Murray scored. But yeah, they were 3-out. I mean, 1990's World Cup was always famous for having the fewest goals per game, and then they made the changes that you couldn't back pass to the goalie. Well, the goalie couldn't handle it; he had to kick it with the back pass. And 3 points per win. I don't remember. Anyway, 1994, they actually got to host the World Cup, so they didn't need to go through qualifying. And let's face it, 1993 was practically the craziest World Cup qualifying year, well, for the 94 tournament. I mean, in North America, Canada had to face Australia in a interconfederational matchup. Australia beat Canada, but the joke was on the Aussies because they had to face the second place team in one of the South American pools, that was Argentina, who's chuckling us to Colombia. And Argentina, of course, beat those pesky Australians. Africa had the thing with Zambia almost qualifying despite losing many of their players in a plane crash. Europe had their own things. I should do an episode based on 1993, the most craziest qualifying campaign ever. Asia had Japan blow it and had the agony of Doha, but they have never missed the World Cup since. And of course, Australia. So, nevertheless, the Americans got to host the '94 World Cup, but they also had to set up a domestic league, and Major League Soccer was born in 1996. So, of course, the razzmatazz, the money, the big football stadiums meant for soccer. Of course, I'm North American, so I have to say soccer. You know what I'm getting at. But anyway, the Americans were paired up with Switzerland, Colombia, and Romania. And a lot of people thought the Americans were going to be screwed and all that. This was the last 2014 World Cup, so they could still qualify as a third place team. They could. Anyway, they took on Switzerland in Pontiac, Michigan at the Silver Dome. And Eric Wynalda did score against the Swiss, but the Swiss surprisingly were decent in '94, and they tied them 1-1. In Pasadena at the Rose Bowl Stadium, the Americans would take on Colombia, who were major tournament favorites. Unfortunately, though, the Americans turned them upside down. Andres Escobar trying to deflect a cross-field pass, put it in his own net. That was not the winning goal. People forget about that. The second goal by Ernie Stewart was. U.S. beat Colombia 2-1, sent them out of the World Cup, and unfortunately, days later, Andres Escobar would be gunned down because of the whole goal. Then they faced Romania, got beaten 1-0, still had enough points and gusto to get to the round of 16, the knockout stages, where Brazil was waiting for them. Surprisingly, Brazil only beat the Americans 1-0 on the 4th of July in Stanford Stadium. Of course, Brazil's Leonardo got himself booted for 8 months for his arm tackle on Tab Rummels. I think it was Tab Rummels. But anyway, that could have been way worse. But Leonardo got lucky. He got 8 months. Then the U.S. had a 4-game losing streak from 1950 to 1990 after that tie, Switzerland. And then in 1998, they qualified for the World Cup. They went to Group F with Germany, Iran, and Yugoslavia. Well, it was Yugoslavia at the time. Yugoslavia and Croatia were kind of broken up, but Yugoslavia still was Yugoslavia, not Serbia and Montenegro. Anywho, in the first game in Paris, they lost 2-0 to the Germans. Well, it's Germany. The second game against Iran was controversial because, the U.S.-Iran tensions at that time. Iran won the game 2-1, even though Brian McBride scored. It was shocking that the Americans would lose to Iran. A lot of people wanted the Americans to beat Iran. I mean, politics aside, that should have happened. Then they lost to Yugoslavia. There were 3-0, 5 straight losses at the World Cup, including '94, when only scoring 1 goal in those 5 games. So thus, the Americans were laughed at. They technically took 32nd out of 32 teams. They did make the 2002 World Cup in Korea and Japan, and then they were about to get beaten. They were placed in Korea in Group D with the host Koreans, Portugal and Poland. A lot of people thought the Americans would have to fight Korea for second place behind Portugal. And then it happened. In Suwon, Korea, they took on the Portuguese. Portugal was expected to bounce those Americans high, heavy, and deep. Anyway, so what happened? Well, the score was 3-2 for the Americans. That's right. The U.S. beat Portugal 3-2. They were up 3-0 at one point. Jim O'Brien, a own goal by Portugal, and Brian McBride. Of course, I would make that mistake with B. McBride on the list. But yeah, it was Brian McBride. And the Americans broke their 5-game World Cup losing streak. They only scored 1 goal in those 5 games. They scored 3 goals in the 1 game against Portugal. They tied the Koreans. Clint Mathis scored. Unfortunately, it was more memorable for Korea's tying goal and the quote-unquote speed skating celebration by the Korean striker. Reason being is because of the whole controversy at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, when one of the Korean speed skaters was disqualified over a tiki-taki foul on Apollo Anton Ono. That wasn't good. They got their butts handed to them by Poland 3-1. Landon Donovan did score. But fortunately, their win, loss, and tie actually did get them to the round of 16 alongside Korea, with Portugal being ruined. In the round of 16, they took on their old rivals, Mexico, in South Korea and beat them 2-0. Brian McBride and Landon Donovan scoring the goals. And, it's always good to beat Mexico, especially at Azteca. They got to the quarters against Deutschland and got beaten 1-0 in Olsen. But I mean, it's Germany. What do you expect? Speaking of Germany, that's where the 2006 World Cup was, and the Americans qualified for that. They were placed in Group E with the Czechs, the Italians, and Ghanaians. This was actually the group of death in most people's eyes. Because the Americans could surprise. Czechs were top 10 at this point. Italy, well, is always Italy. And Ghana might pull one of that. So the first game against the Czechs, they got their butt handed to them 3-0. They ended up losing one of their players to a foul. No, that was from Italy. I think it was Materazzi who got penalized for that foul on the American player. Or I can't remember. But anyway, it was a 1-1 tie against Italy. Fortunately, they scored, but it was an own goal against the eventual World Cup champs. Then they took on Ghana. Clint Dempsey scored, but they gave up 2 as the Americans were 0-2-1. It was like, what the frig? You couldn't get through on that team. Anyway, 2010 in South Africa, they qualified handily. They actually pulled off a miracle in 2009 at the what they called the Confederations Cup. It was the kind of the warm-up for the host nation, which would have the 6 Confederation champions from North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia, and also a few teams sprinkled in there. They shocked Spain to get to the final, which they lost, but it's still good. Anyway, 2010 in South Africa, they were paired up with England, Slovenia, and Algeria. No excuses for the Americans to fuck up this time. They took on England in a famous game in Rustenburg. England scored within the first 4 minutes. It was like, here we go. Of course, I'm an England fan, so I'm biased. But unfortunately for the English fans like myself, Robert Green in the net could not control a simple back pass. Well, a simple shot by Clint Dempsey. It was actually more of a flip shot just to clear the zone, if you will. And then Robert Green could not get it through in his gloves. Tie game 1-1. I was, of course, fuming. And then the second game for the U.S. against Slovenia, not Slovakia, Slovenia, it was a 2-2 tie. Landon Donovan, Michael Bradley scoring. But what's lost in that is that the Americans were down 2-0 to Slovenia. It'd be like, they got a point off England, but they couldn't freaking beat Slovenia. It's like 1950. They scored the win over England, and they couldn't beat Chile. So the Americans were screwed. It was 0-0 going into extra time, injury time against Algeria, in which Landon Donovan scored off his own rebound, and Ian Drake, or Dark, or whatever his name is, on ESPN, go USA. That was a big win because it actually broke a 6-game winless streak in the World Cup. Americans were 0-3-3 in a 6-game span, scoring 6 goals. Right? No, sorry, scoring 5 goals. They beat Algeria. They got to the round of 16 against Ghana. They got to the knockout stages. Ghana, the team in 2006, they couldn't beat. Landon Donovan scored, but then Ghana scored late to tie the game at 1. And then in the second half of extra time, they gave up the winning goal, and Ghana would be going on to face Uruguay and try to get Ghana to become the first African nation in the Final Four. Didn't happen. So the Americans qualified in 2014 in Brasilia. They would take on Ghana, Portugal, and Germany. Well, a lot of people thought they were doomed. Remember, it's top 2 teams move on. They were doomed. It was like, what the fuck? So then they took on their old rivals, Ghana, for the 3rd straight World Cup. And this time, the storybook ended poorly for Ghana. 2-1 win for the Americans. Clint Dempsey and Jim Brooks scoring the goal. Brooks was a late substitution. Then they took on Portugal, and it was a 2-2 tie. Jones and Dempsey scoring the goals for those pesky Americans, giving Portugal fits again. Then they took on Deutschland, lost 1-0 to the eventual world champs. But still, they got 4 points. They got enough to make the round of 16. They took on Belgium. Green scored late. Well, the score was 0-0. Went to extra time. Belgium scored twice in extra time. Remember, in extra time in soccer, 30 minutes of play. It doesn't stop after 1 goal. So anyway, unfortunately for the Americans, they scored late, but they lost to the Belgian Waffles 2-1. And then 2018 came, and the Americans were gifted their World Cup spot on a platter. All they had to do was beat Trinidad and Tobago in Trinidad and Tobago, just like 1990, and they would have went to the World Cup. Lose, and they needed a few results to go their way to at least go to a playoff against Australia. So at least there was a backdoor way. But unfortunately, they fell to the Trinidad team 2-0. No, 2-1, excuse me. It was one of the worst moments because the U.S. defender actually put the ball in his own net, and there was another goaltending mistake. Somehow, in some way, the Americans fell 2-1 to Trinidad, and, things looked bad. However, things were worse as Panama surprised Mexico, I think, and there was another result that didn't go America's way. So not only were the Americans lost, they lost their chance. They were like, well, they couldn't even get to the back door because the back door was closed too. They didn't even get that one-game playoff with Australia. So they had to sit out the 2018 World Cup. And everyone was shocked. Even more shocked when Italy fell at the hurdle to qualify for the World Cup, losing to Sweden in a playoff. 2022 and 2026, they also fell in playoff formats, especially to Bosnia. No, not Bosnia. Who did they fall to? Yeah, they fell to Bosnia. That's right. They fell to Bosnia. In 2022, they did make the World Cup in Qatar. They were careful this time. They took on Wales, England, and Iran in this one. They tied Wales 1-1, the team with Gareth Bale in the Wales' first World Cup in years. Tony Weah scored. Then they had that dull 0-0 tie with the English. England always brings out the best in Americans. Like, the Americans haven't lost to England at the World Cup. They have beaten them in 1950, tied them in 2010, and tied them in 2022. And then they beat Iran 1-0 on a goal by Christian Pulisic. They got revenge for 1998 in a sense. So they took on the Dutch in the round of 16. Wright scored, but the Dutch had the right stuff, winning 3-1. So that was, of course, what they did and all that. So, of course, as in 2026 World Cup, they're in Group D. They'll have to deal with Paraguay, Australia, and Turkey. I think they can, Paraguay and Turkey both in Inglewood, that's in Los Angeles, and Australia in Seattle. Will they go 3 for 3? I think they can. Paraguay, I think they can beat Paraguay. Australia, I think they can beat. Turkey is going to be the wild card in a sense, but you know what to do. So, yeah, so the Americans knew they had to qualify for the World Cup. That's like great, that. Yeah, the Americans were third in that group in 94. If it was top 2, then they would have been screwed. Switzerland would have won in on goal differential. Because Romania were 2-1. Yeah, they had played the 4th of July. And then 98, they embarrassed themselves. 2002, just looking at the stuff. Korea had 7 points. The Americans had 4. Portugal and Poland both had 3. Like, Poland beat the Americans, but it was not enough. And then in 2006, they only had 1 point in that group of death. Italy and Ghana moved on, 7 and 6 points respectively. Americans had 5 points in Group A. They needed that win because if they had tied, they would have been at 3 points, and it would have been Slovenia in the knockout stages, not the Americanos. 2014, they had 4 points, the same as Portugal, but goal differential saved the day for the Americans. 2022, they had 5 points behind England. Yep, I think they'll be fine. I think the Americans will be fine. Landon Donovan holds the record for most World Cup matches as a player with 12. Nobody seemed to be threatening that mark. All that. And Landon Donovan has 5 goals in the World Cup, leading everybody and all that. So, yep. That's what happened. U.S.'s first match was against Belgium in the World Cup, July 13, 1930 in Montevideo, Uruguay. That's their biggest win by 3, and then they beat Paraguay by 3 4 days later in 1930. Biggest defeat, Italy beating them in the knockout thing. Best result was semifinals in 1930 by invitation. They fell in the group stage 5 times, so, the Americans are not the best as they are. They've only won 9 World Cup games. They're 9-20 and 8. Like, you would think the Americans would at least win tons of World Cup games, but they didn't. They just didn't. It was like, what the fuck? But that's what happens. So anyway, that's how the Americans And that's how they have done in the World Cup. Next week, you know what country I got to do next. My home and native land, baby. It's Canada. You could take that to the bank. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Diamond. Adieu.